So greetings, I'm Timothy Snyder. It's the 21st of May, 2018. This is the latest in our little series of informal talks under the heading Timothy Snyder Speaks. What I thought I'd talk about today is the Molar investigation. Because of what I work on and what I write and what I publish, people often ask me, to tell them what's going on in the Molar investigation. I don't know what's going on in the Molar investigation. I don't have any personal connection to the Molar investigation. All I know about the Molar investigation, I read in the same places everybody else does. For me, the Molar investigation is part of a larger story that began several years ago, a story about a turn in Russian foreign policy in which Russia tries to spread influence by getting inside the European Union or getting inside the United States and turning the weaknesses of these very important institutions against themselves. So in Road to Unfreedom, the Mueller investigation turns up very late in the day because it's a very late part of a story that begins much earlier. So rather than telling you any secrets about the Mueller investigation, because I don't have any, what I'd like to do is give you half a dozen reflections about how we might think of the Mueller investigation in the context of contemporary history or in the context of the past and the future of the American Republic. The Mueller investigation has been going on for about a year now, so I thought it might be time to give some reflections. I'm going to try to do 6 under the headings of rule of law, constitution, factuality, international history, oligarchy, and the Republican Party. So let's begin with the rule of law. I think probably the fundamental way to think about the Mueller investigation is as an example of and a defense of, and sad to say, perhaps the last defense of, the rule of law as such. So what's the rule of law? The rule of law is the basic idea, which is very important in our tradition, that we are a government of laws, not men. That it's the law that enables and disables. It's not the individual tyrant who has the power to decide what's going to happen in the fates of other people. This is the basic principle which comes even before the institution of the Constitution. It's the basic principle which animates, for example, the Declaration of Independence, that there is something called the rule of law which can be violated, and that without the rule of law, all is lost, all is chaos. Now, how to be more specific about this? In the history of the way modern governments are formed, there are basically 2 stages, and these 2 stages are spelled out by a very interesting, very important, very significant German sociologist called Max Weber. What Max Weber talks about is this basic problem of how you get from a situation where an individual ruler or person is able to accumulate wealth and hand out the booty. How do you get from there to a situation where a government exists and a government lasts over time, and we can expect that a government is going to last over time? The basic answer to that question is law. Now, in the case of Mr. Trump, we have a problem because by way of legal procedures, we've elected someone who doesn't care about the rule of law. This is a fairly common situation. It happens in other countries all the time. Now we're faced with it ourselves. But I think it's important to understand what we're faced with. And when we do, then we can understand the confrontation between Mr. Trump and Mr. Mueller, not as a matter of 2 tall guys in suits, but rather as a matter of conflicting worldviews, where the stakes couldn't be higher. Mr. Trump, although legally elected, stands for a world where law does not matter. Mr. Mueller is someone whose investigation exemplifies and is meant to enforce the rule of law. Which idea of ourselves we have is maybe the essential question about the Mueller investigation. Do we believe in rule by an individual tyrant, or do we believe in the rule of law? And all this talk of we, and this is my American we, all this talk of we leads me to the second point, which is the Constitution. So as everyone knows, the Constitution is largely about checks and balances. The powers of the legislature are defined in the first article. The powers of the president, the executive, are defined in the second article. And there's a basic notion that the Congress is supposed to check the president. The powers that are enumerated in Article 1 are meant to check the powers that are enumerated in Article 2. One of the reasons why the Mueller investigation is so important constitutionally is that this has failed. So the basic check, which was supposed to work in our system, has not worked. We simply cannot say that the Congress is checking the president. We cannot say that the Congress in the last couple of years has worked to enforce a notion of American law as against foreign influences, as against attempts to influence the structure and policy of the United States. On the contrary, and we have to be honest with ourselves about this, on the contrary, in 2016, the Congress rather acted to ignore and therefore implicitly to invite Russian influence on our presidential election. Think hard about any attempt that Congress made to try to stop Russian influence in 2016. If you're scratching your head, that's right, because Congress did not do anything. On the contrary, Congress deliberately did not act against what its leaders knew to be a concerted effort by a foreign power to affect politics inside the United States. Having done that in 2016, Congress in 2017, perhaps humanly, perhaps predictably, pretended that nothing had happened and went on doing the things that it wanted to do. Now, a patriotic, serious, law-abiding Congress might have said, we will not pass any legislation until we are sure that the executive is not the servant of a foreign power. That, as you might have noticed, is not at all what happened. So the basic check that the Constitution lays out has already failed, which means that the constitutional check that remains is the law itself, which is why the Molar investigation is so important. We don't have the checks. All we have is the idea of the law, right, as represented by the Constitution itself. And so the second way to think about the Molar investigation is constitutionally. Now that checks and balances have failed, what we have left is the notion of the rule of law itself. If that goes, this thing that people, all of us, I'd like to think, people all over the political spectrum care about, which is the Constitution, also goes. Which brings me to number 3, which is factuality. So here again, we see a very important, a very interesting contrast between the value set of the sitting president of the United States and the value set of an investigation carried out by authorized officers of the law. So the president of the United States operates quite openly in a world of unreality. Try to think for a moment of anything that the president has said about Russia which is actually true. It will take a while because basically at every single point in this investigation, or in fact, in every single point in all of the journalistic investigations, every time something has been learned, the president has first denied it and then spun it, making it hard for us to remember what's true. But so I will just say, at every single point, the president has lied or made very misleading statements about what was actually going on in the connections between his campaign, him personally, his administration with the Russian Federation. And this is part of a larger strategy of governance, which is not to admit that anything is true. So try to think of an example where Mr. Trump apologized for making a mistake. We all make mistakes. We all say erroneous things. Mr. Trump much more frequently. That's his skill set than the rest of us. But he never apologizes for an error in fact, because to apologize for an error in fact would be to accept that there is such a thing as facts. And the whole governing strategy of Mr. Trump is to deny that there's any such thing as fact, to make everything a matter of opinion, and then to rule by spectacle. So that's one way of looking at the world. The Molar investigation, or any investigation of this kind, if properly run and managed and overseen, is about facts. So the rule of law and our understanding depends upon findings of facts. What the Mueller investigation is meant to do, and what it does, is it seeks out, it checks, it very carefully verifies facts. It lays down a chain of connections among money and people across countries. And in this sense, it's a kind of second draft of history. So whereas the journalists wrote the first draft of history or are still writing it, what the Mueller investigation does is it writes a kind of second draft of history. I'll give you an example of this. So in Road to Unfreedom, by the time I get to chapter 6, I'm writing about the Russian campaign to get Mr. Trump elected. And there's a certain point in the book where, relying on Russian sources, I'm talking about what the Internet Research Agency is doing on American soil in 2016. And I had a Russian source, a Russian journalistic source, which said that, among other things, they sent Russian citizens to do things on the territory of the US. I was slightly unsure about this. My editor pointed out that I only had one Russian source about this. It hadn't been independently confirmed by American journalists, and so I cut out that part of that one sentence. You might remember that at around the time that Road to Unfreedom was published, the Molar investigation actually indicted a series of Russians for doing just that, for taking an active part on behalf of the Trump campaign on the territory of the United States of America. In other words, in this second draft of history, The Mueller investigation is not just confirming, it's actually finding new facts, which give a shape to history. Which brings me to my next point, which is international history. One of the big problems that we as Americans have is that we tend to think that our own history is cut off from the rest of the world. What the founders did in both the Declaration and the Constitution was try to define an American sphere, legally and morally, to say that out there is, to use their words, tyranny and despotism. Here we're going to establish the rule of law. And we as Americans then have a tendency, I think an unfortunate tendency to say, well, that was done once and for all. We're good, the rest of the world is corrupt. Nothing out there really matters. But the truth is a bit more complicated. The truth is that if we want to maintain this sovereignty and this rule of law, we have to be aware of international history. We have to be aware of globalization and how it actually affects us. The Molar investigation is extremely good at this because it takes American figures, like, for example, Paul Manafort, who's an American citizen, or Michael Cohen, who's an American citizen, and it shows how their connections, the sources of their money or the sources of the money that flow into corporate entities which are theirs, are global. It shows how you can't understand the structure of a presidential election, a presidential campaign, or for that matter, a group of presidential advisors without looking at financial connections around the world. By way of the Molar investigation, and at this point particular indictments, we can now see how these legal structures or moral structures inside the United States are vulnerable to the very tyranny and despotism that the founders were worried about at the very beginning, thanks to financial openness and unscrupulous individual American citizens, which leads me to the next to last point, which is oligarchy. So what could the Molar investigation have to do with oligarchy? Well, in a way, all these points are connected one to the other. What one sees through the Molar investigation is what people close to Mr. Trump, and for that matter, Mr. Trump himself, are really after. One can agree or disagree with my or other people's ideological assessments of Mr. Trump. What is plainly the case is that Mr. Trump is someone who likes to make money. And we all know that uniquely in the last couple of generations, he didn't hand over his tax returns. We all know that he still has investments around the world which are affected by the steps, by the choices that he makes as president of the United States. By way of the Mueller investigation, we can see some of the outlines of the specific connections between Mr. Trump, who is a wannabe oligarch. He's not a real oligarch yet, but now that he's president, he might become one. The connections between our wannabe oligarch and actual oligarchs around the world. We can also see the specific connections between, for example, Paul Manafort and Oleg Deripaska, a Russian oligarch, or between Michael Cohen and Viktor Vekselberg, another Russian oligarch. People say that whenever, at every scandal in the Trump administration, you shake a tree and out comes a Russian. That's only half the truth. You shake a tree and out comes a Russian oligarch. And this is specifically very important because, again, here the American Republic is in the balance. We're facing a kind of basic choice. Is politics meant to be about a few oligarchs, or is politics meant to be about the citizenry as a whole? This is a president who openly thinks that the whole point of the republic is to make him an oligarch. The longer we nod at that, the closer we get to a world where law doesn't really matter, and facts don't really matter, and the Constitution doesn't really matter. And now, the oligarchy point is also central to the republic in a different way, because the oligarchs, right? Trump, the wannabe oligarch, Putin, the real oligarch who runs a country, Vekselberg, Deripaska, the Koch brothers, it doesn't matter. All of these billionaires obviously have much more in common with one another than they have with you and me. So if you let the American Republic become a kind of staging ground for world oligarchy, which is Mr. Trump's motto as far as I can tell, then what we're doing is we're letting slip away the notion of an American Republic, or for that matter, of patriotism, which is the last point that I wanted to make about the soul of the Republican Party. Because it seems to me that there's something very basic at stake here about what the Republican Party is actually about. I will not be betraying any secrets if I say that the FBI and similar organizations inside the US government are largely staffed by Republicans. I will be betraying no secrets if I note the number of people who are carrying out serious investigations of the president are, in their private lives, Republicans. They tend to be Republicans who believe that there is an American republic, that there is a rule of law, that they're conservatives in the sense that they believe in the continuity and the reality of sovereignty and law. And that's a very important tradition, and one to take seriously. And in my view, it's one to respect. And I think, by the way, that it's also a very widespread view, and I'll be corrected, among Republican voters that the United States is a real country, that the United States should be sovereign, that the United States should have a distinct identity as opposed to the rest of the world. What's at stake is whether the Republican Party, in the sense of Republican elected officials, actually believes that. Because at the moment, both at the level of the presidency and at the level of Congress, we're slipping towards a situation where the Republican Party, an awful lot of the Republican Party, let's put it this way, the parts of the Republican Party which aren't taking Russia seriously, or the parts of the Republican Party that are threatening Mr. Mueller, those parts of the Republican Party are also the parts, and unfortunately they're big parts, that are slipping towards becoming nothing more than a service class for international oligarchy. That would be an unfortunate situation. And I think it's also, there's also here a marked difference between what Republican voters think they're voting for and what their elected officials are actually doing. I think there are probably zero Republican voters who think that the Republican Party should be a service class for world oligarchy. But there are a lot of Republican elected officials who behave as though that is their job description. And so I think this is also very serious. This is the sixth and last point. There's a kind of struggle for the soul of the Republican Party going on. That's part of the significance of the Molar investigation. So just what I've been trying to do here is to take a step back, rather than going over the blow by blow, rather than mentioning Trump's latest threat to Moller or the latest finding of the Molar investigation. What I've been trying to do is to put the whole thing into perspective, to give us a sense of why this matters and why, if it stopped, that would be a blow to law, factuality, and I think even sovereignty, the kind of thing that all of us would probably want to react to, or put it much more strongly, if the Mueller investigation is called off, if Mr. Trump finds a way to bring it to an end, that would be, I think, a very basic moment to reflect upon whether it means anything to you, to me, to any of us, to be an American. Thanks.